Dear friends, our study today will be around chapter 17 of the book of Revelation. You do realize that we have moved forward and are now drawing closer to the end of the book and towards the end of human history. We must now go into the details regarding the judgment of Babylon. At the end of chapter 16, Babylon was divided into three, was fallen, and drunk of the cup of God's wrath. Well, the next section will give us more details regarding this fall, and that's what will be the main point of our study now. This section, the judgment of Babylon, is really extensive. It goes from chapter 17, verse 1, to the middle of chapter 21, verse 8. It includes not only the judgment of Babylon itself, but also the judgment of its individual components. For when Babylon will be divided and fall, the various elements that compose it will continue to exist and will each be judged according to its deeds. Let's turn to chapter 17. This chapter is quite interesting, but finally, its structure is rather simple. First, there is an inaugural scene that we are going to read. A woman seated on a beast. She is a prostitute. Then Apostle John's amazement, she asks for explanation. And the angel will give him a series of explanations, and all these explanations will spread throughout chapter 17. He will reveal the identity of the beast, the meaning of the heads, what the horns are, what the waters represent, and finally, who the woman is. In verses 16 and 17, we are given more than an explanation. It is a step forward in action. The other point I would like to develop together with you is a parallel with the second section, that of the seals. If we look at the second section from chapter 4, the seals section, where we have already seen that the judgment of the house of God has begun, there stands a real parallel. There is a parallel in the topics, of course. Since the seal section deals with the judgment of the house of God, while this section 6 we are now studying deals with the judgment of Babylon. But there are even closer relationships. For example, in chapter 4, we see God sitting on his throne, and we understand that he is judging, while the woman sits on a beast in chapter 17. God is surrounded by 24 elders and 4 living creatures. The woman is supported by a beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns. Those around God in chapter 4 pay tribute to him, while in chapter 17, those surrounding the woman and or upholding her will eventually destroy her. In short, God is worthy of starting the judgment, while the woman is deemed unworthy. Another detail is obvious. Throughout chapter 4, God does not act. He does not intervene. So, similarly in chapter 17, the woman is apparently passive. The one who acts in chapter 5 is the lamb. Likewise, the one that will act in chapter 17 is the beast. And then, there are similarities in the presentation. Speaking to John, the angel says, I will show you, dexo in Greek. I will show you what will happen in chapter 4, and I will show you what will happen in chapter 17. Still another parallel, a parallel with the New Jerusalem. If we look and if we compare chapter 17 and chapter 21, we see two women are facing each other. The first one in chapter 17 is a prostitute. The second one in chapter 21 is the New Jerusalem. And there is no comparison whatsoever, but a complete contrast. We will see it all along the text. For example, one is dressed in scarlet, the other one is clothed with fine linen. One is adorned with precious stones, the other one is a precious stone. She looks like jasper. One is at sea level, on many waters, or in the desert. The other one is on a high mountain. In short, everything opposes them. Now, let's move forward and let's try to understand a little more about this woman, who she could be. Who is this prostitute? I invite you to turn to this text and read with me chapter 17 from verse 1, and we'll be reading up to verse 6. Then, one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication." So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and of filthiness of her fornication. And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. We do understand the astonishment of John, but let's analyze what is going on here verse by verse. May I suggest we read again the first verse? Revelation 17, verse 1. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, "Come, and I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters." Well, it is the same way that one of the 7 angels who held the 7 bowls will present the New Jerusalem. Let's look at it in chapter 21, verse 9. Revelation 21, verse 9. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls filled with the 7 last plagues came to me and talked with me, saying, "Come, I will show you the bride, the Lamb's wife." At this point, we understand that there can be only 2 solutions. Either the one will belong to the people of Babylon, or one will belong to the people of the New Jerusalem. As I have told you earlier, everything opposes the 2 women. Let's move into the text and let's read the following. This great prostitute sits on the water, on many waters. Revelation 17:1. The great harlot who sits on many waters. If we take the text as a whole, this woman is sitting in different ways. She sits on many waters, but she also sits on the beast. The text also says that she sits on 7 heads. And when John sees her, she is in the wilderness. It is difficult to imagine that in the wilderness she sits on many waters. Therefore, there is clearly a symbolical value that we must understand here. So let's keep on step by step. First, she sits on many waters. An indication which we'll value much here is found in Psalm 29, verse 3. Let's read it. Psalm 29, verse 3. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord is over many waters. So, in this text, God is the one over many waters. And when the explanation will be given us about the waters, one will understand that they represent peoples, nations, multitudes, and tongues, and understand that it is God who rules the world. But Babylon also claims to rule the world, and because of this, it usurps the place of God. This goes to the heart of what I was saying earlier about the competition between God and Babylon. It gives us an interesting indication. If Babylon is the one being judged in chapter 4, then of course it is the judgment of the house of God. But somehow it is God Himself who is judged in His own judgment. Now, let's tackle a second point. She sits on 7 heads. This is mentioned a little further in verse 9. Let's read it together. Revelation 17:9. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. We have already seen this explanation. 7 mountains. This evokes the city of 7 hills. So, Rome. Therefore, it seems that the headquarters of this woman, of this organization, is Rome. It is probably a religious organization. We have seen that when a people is defined as a woman, it has to do with a relationship with God, God being the bridegroom, and the church the bride. But you'll notice that this is quite a different definition from what we have seen so far. So Babylon will be defined differently. It is an entity which reigns over the kings of the earth, and that is not the case yet. We'll have to understand who Babylon is. Now, a third element is that she sits on a beast. The beast we know already. It is that which was defined in chapter 13. But the religious political system of the Middle Ages has long ceased. However, the text warns us that a religious political system will re-emerge from the old Europe. And this beast on which the woman sits is the beast that re-emerges from this difficult period, that almost dead situation that had been imposed to her by the French Revolution. Finally, we need to understand one last thing. This woman is in the wilderness. So, the fact that she is still in the wilderness certainly tells us, of course, something that is different from the many waters. We have already seen a woman in the wilderness. Remember, we saw her in chapter 12. Let me remind you this, chapter 12, verse 13. Revelation 12, 13 and 14. Now, when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. In chapter 12, we have a woman who fled into the wilderness pursued by the dragon. Could she be the same woman? The text does not say so explicitly. But if she were the same, then we would understand John's astonishment. In chapter 12, he left a faithful woman who flees to the desert from the attacks of Satan. Satan, the dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And now he finds this woman completely prostitute. He finds her adorned with jewelry. He finds her back sitting on a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. So, if we have come to this point, then this woman has considerably evolved. Note that already in chapter 12, it was something that could make us think. Indeed, the dragon has attacked a seed and even to the rest of the seed. Let's read it together. Revelation 12, 16, 17. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandment of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. We should perhaps have to understand that the woman was no longer completely faithful to the commandments of God, that only her seed followed them. In short, one can still understand John's astonishment. Now, I invite you to read with me verse 2, which we are going to study together. Revelation, chapter 17, verse 2. With whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. What is this fornication? I propose we look at some texts to understand what we are talking about. We have here a description of the fornication with the kings of the earth. But basically, whenever a people of God seeks support elsewhere rather than from God, elsewhere rather than from a husband, then it is fornication. Let's read some texts. First, I suggest we read in the book of Exodus, chapter 34, verse 15. Exodus 34:15. For you shall worship no other God, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they play the harlot with their gods, and make sacrifice to their gods, and one of them invites you, and you eat of his sacrifice. Offering sacrifice to other gods is already fornication. But let's go a little further. Fornication is also looking at other elements, and I invite you to see what could happen through a text we find in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 6. And the person who turns to mediums and familiar spirits to prostitute himself with them, I will set my face against that person and cut him off from his people. So, there is the possibility of prostitution with the spirits of the dead, just because you go to seek help from them. But no, it is only in God that we can find real help. And there are other elements, especially a people can get help from other people, other powers, other kings. And the text of Ezekiel chapter 16 is extremely accurate in this regard. It shows that the people of Israel looked for help from Egypt when the Assyrians attacked. They do not only want to seek help from Egypt, they even paid for it. And God mocks at them, saying, "You're like a prostitute with the difference that you are the one paying your lovers." And ultimately, at the end of this text, judgment comes from her lovers. So we see in verse 6, this woman drunk with the blood of the saints. She is not only drunk with the blood of the saints. In Revelation 14:8, she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. This means that the woman succeeded in bringing all nations of the earth to accept her political powers and to cope with the collusion of political and religious. But at the same time, with this allegiance, it resulted in the persecution of God's people. And it is all the nations that are drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of Jesus' witnesses. We can even think that she led them to prostitution, in praying to the dead in any manner whatsoever, and trading with them as well. Moreover, in chapter 18, it is said that she has become a dwelling of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. So I think it is important, regardless of the apparent beauty of a system, adorned with gold and precious stones, a seductive system, a powerful system, it is important to stay away from that, not to be seduced, because this system, if it takes us away from God, can lead us to become ourselves prosecutors. Whatever your affiliation, religious, political, associative, if this affiliation drives you or makes you associate, however small, to an oppressive group, then flee this system. Despite its brilliance, do not become yourself a persecutor. It is better to be on the persecuted side than on the persecutors.